How's it going, everybody? This is Zachary Perez, and this is my PE 589 capstone for Professor Andrew Oslot of Fall 1, 2019. First off, I want to congratulate everybody for completing this capstone journey alongside me. I'm really excited to present my research and my findings to you guys, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I enjoy bringing it to you. So, my research revolves around coaching, specifically how flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics affect basketball players' athleticism and confidence. So, with that being said, the reason I was super interested in this topic was because I played basketball my whole life. I played it in high school, I played it in college, I coached in college, and now I'm a head coach at a high school. So, extremely exciting stuff. I really find interest in it, and there's just so many different values you can instill in kids through sports and especially basketball. With that being said, I really believe that sports or that the sport of basketball is one of the most demanding sports because of the high intensity and complex movements. That makes it difficult kind of to assess overall. With that being said, I did a lot of research, and basically researchers slimmed it down to first step explosiveness, lateral quickness, and vertical jump ability alongside anaerobic capacity, being in shape and all that stuff as significant factors to be, effective both on the offensive side and the defensive side of the court. So um, I really kind of wanted to narrow down what aspects of basketball were extremely important and then try to figure out the best ways to improve those through flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics in a training system. Now, with that being said, my purpose statement of the study was basically to gather enough information to examine the effects of those flexibility, mobility, and plyometric movements that they can have on high school basketball players' performance and confidence throughout the season. The reason why I kind of wanted to assess confidence is because, a lot of the time in sports you hear that half the game is mental. So obviously we love to see the physical improvements, but I think a big thing that I wanted to assess was also the mental and psychological aspects of being confident enough to apply what you learned and all that into a sports specific setting throughout the season. Because, like it's always said, half the game is mental, half the game is physical. So, with that being said, I developed four central research questions. The first one being, what was the effect that flexibility, mobility, and plyometric training had on an athlete's first step? The second one was being what was the effect of flexibility, mobility, and plyometric training on an athlete's vertical jump? The third being, what was the effect that flexibility, mobility, and plyometric training had on a high school player's lateral quickness? And at the end of that, obviously, we wanted to assess some perception and psychological aspects. So my fourth research question was actually, what is the perception that high school athletes have on flexibility, mobility, and plyometric training that they may not be familiar with? So that was something that I was extremely excited about. So to dive in about the article reviews, the first one had to deal with flexibility and the type of stretching that can have an effect on a person's performance. So Sampson and company basically did a study to examine how general sports specific warm-ups affected a person's performance, whether it included or incorporated stretching that was either static or dynamic. What they did was basically got 20 to 25 people, male and female, and they put them through a pre and post test, which was, I believe, a 20-yard meter sprint. And they put them under four different protocols. Static stretching with just a general warm-up, dynamic stretching with a general warm-up, static stretching with a sport-specific warm-up, and then dynamic stretching with a sports-specific warm-up. And what they found was that 20-meter sprint times improved with those sports-specific warm-ups, whether it was dynamic or static stretching groups. And on the other hand, when it was just general warm-ups, they didn't see as big of an increase which basically shows that sport-specific stretches relating to the performance have a greater impact on overall sports performance. And the big reason that's super important is because um, in applying this, you can see that integrating static stretching or dynamic stretching with a sport-specific warm-up can generate greater range of motion in an athlete. It also increases their sprint performance, and that's super important in a person's ability to functionally move, functionally change direction, and sprint in sports or athletic activity. The reason why I felt like this article review was so important because these are all aspects of basketball that can definitely be improved through sport-specific stretching and sport-specific training to enhance their abilities moving forward in basketball, just like how it was tied into sprinting. And as you know, basketball is a game of going up and down the court, so there are numerous instances where you do have to sprint. And I felt like this article review really helped me, kind of dive into that aspect of flexibility and how it improves everything, and kind of shaped what we were going to do during the 3-week training period. Now, the second article review we came across had to deal with mobility. For those of you who don't know, foam rolling and joint distraction with a resistance band, basically just moving a specific joint with some resistance, are both aspects of mobility. So those were something that we also did in the 3-week training program. And we found a study by Gilead and company, basically trying to find out twofold. One was determining if foam rolling and joint distraction using elastic bands could specifically be applied to increase those range of motion in joints, and to determine if there was any differences in range of motions from foam rolling, whether it was a 5-minute sequence, whether it was a 10-minute sequence, or 15-minute sequence. So it was super interesting. They grabbed 30 male national rugby players, so some high-level athletes obviously they came across, and they had to be free of any injuries of the hips and lower extremity. Basically, they collected numerical data and compared, their aspects of mobility in the hips, and through a quantitative design, they found that regardless of the duration time, all athletes' range of motion scores increased dramatically. Throughout the body, each athlete saw nearly a 20% increase after a 7-week period. The second experiment, using the elastic band for joint distraction, also improved flexibility alongside those range of motion and numerous stretches and their ability to explode and get into a squatting position. So, the aspects of foam rolling and joint distraction really showed throughout a 7-week period that it can have numerous effects. Although we didn't have the same amount of time, we felt that in a 4 or 3-week period that we can kind of implement some mobility and increase that range of motion to, create better flexibility and better movement throughout the joints while they're working out or while playing basketball. So the application to this article review, well, basically that they relate to the current trends of sports and physical education because it enhances their range of motion and mobility patterns that are specific to their sport. Obviously, this has to deal with rugby players, but in terms of basketball training, it's important that basketball athletes have that full range of motion in their lower extremity because of the demand that it places on their hip flexors when they're moving laterally side to side, or hamstrings, or so on and so forth. But basically, if you don't have that range of motion on the basketball court, there has been plenty of instances or personal experiences where I know basketball players have had groin injuries, hip injuries, and so on and so forth, just because their range of motion is not where it needs to be. So that was another interesting one that we liked integrating. And my last article review has to deal with plyometrics. Obviously, we wanted to cover flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics. We found a good article review by Ramirez and Company that basically compared the fitness levels between soccer players before and after an 8-week period that combined, plyometrics with traditional bilateral and unilateral movements. Although this was a different sport, I think the results and the methods and all that really played a factor in how we can generate it towards basketball and see similar results. Um, so basically, they got 18 male soccer players between the ages of 17 and 18. They tested for change of direction ability, horizontal, vertical jump ability, um, vertical jump on one leg, vertical jump on two legs, so on and so forth in a quantitative design. Um, and what they found was that basically over an 8-week period of plyometrics and strength training, that change of direction saw a 3.1% increase. Basically, another thing was their bilateral jump performance increased by about 17%. And then also their unilateral jump ability increased by 8%. Um, and the application with this, that it basically demonstrates to coaches that they can implement plyometric training in any program um, to basically increase the unilateral and bilateral strength in order to maximize an athlete's performance. The study can basically help coaches and trainers develop the appropriate exercises and program to increase student athlete explosiveness in their respective sports, especially like basketball. And what we found was through this that once again, sport specific training has to do a lot with the improvements in a certain movement. So if you're training for a vertical jump and you're starting doing jump squats, that's obviously going to help a bilateral movement. If you're training to do a single leg jump, obviously lunges or an elevated split squat where you're on one leg, that's going to further impact your unilateral jump performance. So good takeaways from these article reviews. So a little bit about my personal methodology. Basically, a meeting was set up with Santa Ana Valley High School's athletic director to gain permission to instruct athletes in Hope to improve, their performance, once again, their confidence, and then just overall health. To be an active participant in this study, we asked that all student athletes complete a minor consent form, which needed to be signed by both the athlete and their parents if they were not 18 years old, and no athlete was over 18 years old. All athletes were informed by their coaching staff that regardless, they were going to have to participate in this 3 to 4 week training program because it was going to be their off-season training. So I was extremely excited to work with the kids, regardless if they wanted to be a part of my research or not, just to benefit them in any way. Participants were pre-tested on their vertical jump, their lateral quickness, and their first step explosiveness before taking part in the 4-week training program. At the end of the 4 weeks, they were once again post-tested for their results and documented for their test scores. At the end of that 4-week period, we outlined a survey. We gave them back their papers of their pre and post test scores, and they sat in a classroom on Google Forms, just filled out that bad boy, and finished it out electronically. A little bit about the participants. They were just all male high school athletes between 9th and 10th grade. 9th and 12th grade. Ages 14 to 18. Didn't have any 18-year-olds, so 14 to 17. And all participants were actually part of the Santa Ana Valley men's basketball program. In order to be part of the men's basketball program, you had to be enrolled in their 6-period basketball class. Some of the methods we used were obviously qualitative and quantitative data collected through the survey and questionnaire that was submitted electronically. Quantitative had to do with all the numerical data, and then the qualitative was basically the perceptions that they felt about the plyometric mobility and flexibility training. The survey instrument was called the Boys Basketball Training survey, BBTS for short. It was basically a three-part survey consisting of a demographic section, a pre and post test comparison section that also had Likert scale um, questions labeled 1 through 5. In the last section, there was an open-ended section with multiple choice to once again assess the players' perspectives about the training program. Overall, there was about 23 questions, I believe. So that brings us into our results. Basically, the preliminary analysis we got was, the average age between the athletes that were participating in this study were pretty young, only about 15.3 years of age. Between the 16 participants, their basketball and organization experience only ranged between 1.9 to 2 years. So we were definitely dealing with some beginning athletes, not some that were familiar with what we were going to show them. To build on that, we asked how often they perform flexibility, plyometric, or mobility movements. 37% basically said they did none. 25% said that they did it once a week, and another 37% said they did it maybe once to twice a week. So once again, the athletes that we were dealing with didn't necessarily have the biggest background in athletic training in terms of flexibility, mobility, or plyometrics. So basically what we found in our quantitative main analysis for our first step explosiveness, we measured a 5-yard sprint time that had to deal with starting with your right foot to lead off and starting with your left foot to lead off. And basically what happened was athletes who started off with their right foot saw a 0.14% increase, or a 0.14 second increase in their overall times, and a 0.9 second increase with their left foot. So when we asked these athletes how each flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics enhanced their abilities to kind of get an aspect of their perspectives, 81.3% felt that flexibility impacted their 5-yard sprint time either neutrally, effective, or very effectively. When asked about mobility, another 81.3% said it was either neutral, effective, or very effective. And then when asked about plyometrics, how they believe it impacted their first step, they said that 87.5% it was either neutral, effective, or very effective. As we move towards lateral quickness, we had athletes perform a 5-yard shuffle up and back, 10 yards total. And basically what athletes saw was an average of 0.23 second increase after a 3 to 4 week training program. Once again, we asked how flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics all had an impact. When in terms of flexibility, 87% felt that their impact was either neutral, effective, or very effective. In terms of the mobility, 100% for the first time felt that it was either neutral, effective, or very effective when it came to impacting their lateral quickness. And then when asked about plyometrics, and once again went back down to 87.6% who felt that it was neutral, effective, or very effective. For our last one that had to deal with physical improvement, we tested for a standing vertical jump to assess vertical jump performance. And basically, the athletes saw an average of 0.65 inches of an increase during the 3 to 4 week intervention. Basically, what happened there was when we asked about the impacts of flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics, is where we saw the biggest belief in what we were doing. When asked about flexibility impacting those vertical jump performance, 100% of people said it was either neutral, effective, or very effective. When asked about mobility, 100% once again said it was neutral, effective, or very effective. And when plyometrics was asked, 92% believed it was neutral, effective, or very effective. And to build on that, obviously, it was interesting to see how each person labeled their differences or their improvements. There may be a possibility that based on the amount of improvement they saw, is how they felt that they actually um, rated their flexibility, mobility, and plyometric effectiveness. Um, so obviously we have our fourth research question that sought to analyze the perception that high school athletes had on the training that they were receiving as a result of the training implementations. I'm sorry. Most participants expressed that they felt improvement in many areas. Majority of participants, when they got their multiple choice question, uh, that labeled you can select all that apply, felt that they got in fact stronger and more confident in the movements they're participating in. And a smaller group stated that they felt faster or more explosive. One participant in particular believed that he became stronger and more explosive in addition to the his own ability to explode faster. Um, from another response that we gathered, a different player said that he could attack the basket with a stronger mentality and a stronger approach to the game, with a tougher mindset in general. Um, so from these gathered responses, it kind of demonstrates that athletes indeed felt that flexibility, mobility, and plyometrics had an impact on their physical confidence and their capabilities moving forward. That brings us into our discussion. Our first discussion, obviously, was very similar to Sampson and Company's um, findings that basically that static stretching and dynamic stretching with a sports-specific warm-up increased an athlete's 20-meter sprint time, although this was brought on a smaller scale. We obviously did it in a 3-week to 4-week span where we did sport-specific movement, sport-specific flexibility, and all this in preparation of a basketball season to feel more confident in those movements, to feel more confident in their first step. And our improvements were also honestly just based on that 5 yard sprint time, but regardless, in a 3 to 4 week period, there was improvements that were seen through the sport specific flexibility movements that included those dynamic and static stretching throughout the program. And basically what that did was basically create a notion to include those sport specific flexibility exercises into the current study and see basically how to improve first step and sprint time on a magnified scale, because basketball is so constant where you're changing direction and sprinting. In terms of mobility, a lot of our findings went hand in hand with Gillatt and Company's article that concluded basically that foam rolling and joint distraction can improve flexibility and range of motion pre and post test scores on a 3-week scale. Obviously, there was 7, so their impacts were probably a little bit greater. We had ours in a 3-week, and it wasn't just mainly focused on, mobility. But basically, I think athletes really felt that, their aspects of mobility changed their ability to, move laterally, increase their lateral quickness, because when we had our responses, 100% for the first time felt that mobility impacted their lateral quickness, either neutral, effective, or very effectively, and that's all based on their post-test scores that might have played a role, but it's hard to argue against the fact that many athletes felt that they can get in a lower stance, a better position to move laterally in a 5-yard span and just on the court. That range of motion really played a vital factor in how they ultimately felt moving forward. Obviously, in previous studies, in terms of plyometrics, our stuff goes hand in hand with Ramirez's study that indicated that the principle of specificity plays a large role in attempting to prove a form of jump ability. Uh, in his study, they obviously did bilateral movements and they did unilateral movements, and a lot of the bilateral movements were had a greater increase throughout their training period because they were practicing 2-foot jumps and 2-foot training. On the other hand, the unilateral group had a greater increase because they were constantly practicing on one leg. And that's something that we definitely took into account. We obviously knew that we were testing for a standing vertical jump. That played a vital role in, you know, doing squat jumps, squatting, creating range of motion in the hips so we can have a deeper squat and all that moving forward. But we also made sure to implement aspects of unilateral training because basketball is a unilateral jumping sport. There's obviously layups, you're jumping to block a shot. There are many instances where you're actually going off one leg, but for the most part of this study, a great deal was focused bilaterally. In terms of vertical jump performance, our stuff also goes hand in hand with Tancred and Tancred's study, basically that stated flexibility and mobility have a vital role in improving vertical jump performance because tight hamstrings and the angle of which the pelvis is tilted can have a great impact on a person's range of motion and their ability to explode. Knowing this, we kind of sought to, show proper form, increase mobility, so that athletes had better form to jumping, and that kind of showed in the overall test scores for these athletes that we tested. And lastly, Blazevich's study kind of went hand in hand with our players' perceptions of the overall training. It's no surprise that player confidence went up as the weeks progressed. In Blazevich's study, the results indicated that stretching as part of the warm-up routine basically had a great impact on a non-athletic population, whether it was psychological stability, preparation, or confidence in their performance. Although their athletes were non-athletic, a lot of our athletes were only 2 years into the process, or they're coming from a non-recreational background, so there's definitely a noticeable impact on those same characteristics. In terms of recommendations, implications, and future research, strength and conditioning coaches can utilize this information to help construct their own training program that includes flexibility, mobility, and plyometric movements for the specific sport their athletes are training for. I also think this is a big calling for strength and conditioning coaches because they can improve those movements in weight training to increase those range of motion, the muscle flexibility, and that explosive power of movements. We have to understand if you have a client or athletes who are new to a lot of the movements, it's important to build flexibility, build that range of motion before just throwing them into the fire and, destroying their confidence because they feel like they can't do it right. I think implementing these aspects was kind of a baby step for a lot of our athletes, and I think it can really help benefit strength and conditioning coaches. I also want to call on physical educators because I believe they can also benefit from this research findings. Throughout the program, a lot of these athletes were introduced to basic movements that they had never even been introduced to before. If you're a high school coach or you're in a high school setting, you're basically these kids' physical education teachers. So it's their responsibility for a coach to introduce proper and lifelong information that a student athlete can use in the future to benefit themselves. With that being said, I know these kids did not come from a recreational background, so physical educators can also implement a lot of these movements in just their basic curriculum for athletes or student athletes just to understand and use for the future. Additional research, I believe, needs to be done on hip mobility scores, specifically on basketball players, to determine effective ways to increase that range of motion. I think this research can play a vital role in pushing exercise professionals to assess that overall mobility performance, and one day assist in the injury prevention and develop strength. Like I said, I've been around a lot of basketball, and we deal with a lot of hip injuries, a lot of groin injuries, and I really do believe it's because of um, low mobility in the lower body. Limitation in this research basically that it was hard to assess, physical mobility. We tested for improvements in lateral quickness, improvements in first step explosiveness, and vertical jump. We didn't really measure improvements in flexibility, improvements in mobility, and improvements in plyometric training. So, I think it's important for research to be done, and within that, we can kind of pinpoint what helps these basketball players improve the most moving forward to improve those aspects of basketball that they're looking for. The last thing, obviously, is just another limitation was that we were dealing with young athletes. So it was extremely easy to build confidence within these athletes because we understood that, it was only their second year and they've been introduced to a lot of this stuff for the first time. I think future researchers should conduct a similar study in for more experienced athletes and see if they can get similar results both psychologically and physically. In terms of our references, we have Gilead, Sampson and Ramirez, and Tancred. We learned a lot from those references and those articles and kind of helped us shape what we wanted to do for our 3-week training program and kind of just assess what to look for moving forward. Huge acknowledgments to